Hello everybody and welcome back to another Toonkind at 12 FPS. My name is Avi and today I will be doing a solo FPS with Shiro Azumi and Hatsumi Akisato. This is going to be very, very similar to the last one I did during the Yellow Trip. We're still in the Yellow Trip actually. So yeah, once again, I have pre-written and pre-rolled everything that you're about to hear, and that link will be shared in the description of the recording and also in the FPS rolling zone right here, right now. So if you want to follow along and read it, you just open up in a new tab. And there you go. But yes, I also have a cup of water right next to me, so if you hear me pause at any point throughout this FPS, it is because I am drinking water. Alright. And without further ado, let us begin. Get some fresh air. It's such a simple idea, really. Stupidly simple. Of course, secluding himself in a singular room would be counterproductive. But sometimes, when it feels as though the world around you and everything you know is coming down and crashing around your ears, the only thing you can hope to do is try to get away from it all for some time. To hit a metaphorical pause button, to step away and try to breathe and recenter yourself before you tumble along with everything else. His first attempt to go outside went poorly, perhaps for the better, when the intent had been to fall back on that bad habit. Had Moria not found him, he might have genuinely followed through with feeding the old addiction and fallen to the bottom of a hole he'd only recently dragged himself out of. Did he drag himself out of it? It's so hard to tell. In the height of his career, when he'd been so focused on the case involving the spirit rogues and trying to figure out how to deal with them, it may have been more so that he had forgotten it and left it behind rather than actively quit it. There is a reason he still has the box of cigarettes, he thinks, and it may in fact be that he never got rid of it in the first place. And so, this is his second attempt. No metaphorical old itch involved. Just an invitation relayed by a mutual acquaintance. Satomi had made the offer to walk him to the meeting point, something that Azumi found strange, but not unexpected, likely a measure taken because of his recent behavior. And he would meet with her in her new garden. Fresh air, and as Satomi had put it, maybe getting his hands dirty would help him get his mind off of things. He has no idea why he agreed to meet with her. Okay, perhaps that is not entirely true. If he stopped to think about it, Azumi would be able to draw connections. Perhaps the subconscious realization that they may be able to relate to each other on some level. After all, there is quite a bit of their respective lifestyles that were similar. High-end venues and being surrounded by adults in powerful positions. He swallows a weight in his throat and it tastes poison. Maybe he shouldn't have gone through with this. Really, it would be so much easier on the both of them. Akisato would not have to be face-to-face with her father's murderer, and Azumi would not have the constant weight on his chest that he feels whenever he is in proximity to her. Azumi-san, could you please bring that watering can over here? But, as it is currently, he can't turn back now. He's already in the garden at Akisato's estate, hands dirty from mindlessly digging into the soil in order to plant newer flowers. There is no point in trying to run from this now, is there? He can't, even if he tries, so instead he nods and rises to his feet, reaching for one of the watering cans and hands it over to Akisato. And for a very long moment, it's silent as she turns back to the plants, and Azumi can't help but watch her work. The delicacy of her movements being outlined by the light of the sun, the softness of her hands betraying a hidden strength that he himself has seen, and, in one occasion, been on the receiving end of. He takes it all in for a moment, being acutely aware of the situation he is in, something he cannot say in regards to the past day or so. But the question practically begs itself. Why did you invite me here? Akisato pauses, lifting the can out of the pouring position and turning her gaze in Azumi's direction before hesitating and moving to the next patch as she searches for words. I admit it's a bit of a selfish reason. Hardly surprising. She huffs under her breath, but continues. I've heard from the others that you have not been feeling well lately, so I figured some fresh air might do you some good. It's refreshing to take a moment to be among the flowers, no matter how short the time may be, and putting energy towards a task is beneficial to get yourself moving again. Right. Azumi rolls his eyes. Now you sound like Satomi. Well, maybe Arata-kun has the right idea, Akisato retorts, and a small smile on her face before it slips and she trudges on. But aside from that, I wanted to make sure that you aren't hurting yourself. Right. People are worried about him. More people than he realized are worried about him. Beneath the static numbness, he can feel the phantom stab through his heart, but he manages to swallow the feeling long enough to glance away from the other. You worry too much. I already have enough individuals looking after me as is. Others looking after you is not the same as looking after yourself, Azumi-san, Akisato replies, and her brow furrows further in frustrated concern. Care is not exactly something you can slide onto the people around you. People will do what they will regardless of what I do. That's not the point I'm trying to make. Then what is your point? Azumi hisses, and he could feel the remains of the defensive walls struggle to rebuild themselves. But the glare he levels in Akisato's direction doesn't last for very long, and he suddenly finds himself unable to maintain eye contact. The point is, Akisato starts, taking a deep breath to keep herself from getting angry. Azumi has to wonder if she's had to do so before, if she has been in a position in which the adults around her refuse to take her seriously all because of how young she is. It must be difficult to be surrounded by such individuals, stockholders and chairmen, and knowing that they will never quite take her at the same level as they are due to her age. Have they scoffed at her sudden inheritance in her presence? Have they considered the mess that had been left for her after her father's death? Why is he thinking about that now? Stockholders and chairmen, police detectives and legislators? The looks they give him when they think he doesn't notice irritates him to no end. He remembers the recent conversation he had with Kishimoto. The idea that someone is able to understand how he feels, even in a way that might be entirely tangential, feels so foreign. And yet, somehow, for some reason, he allows himself to drop the shattered remains of walls that have felt so defensive. Perhaps Akisato is trying to understand. After all, just as a corvid may pluck its own feathers out of stress, plants, too, experience shock and anxiety after being uprooted and transplanted into new soil. The point is, Akisato says, and Azumi turns his head back to look at her as she speaks. You have already made great progress by coming back here, if it is true that you really do want to better yourself. But bettering yourself takes effort, and by shirking responsibility onto others, you are doing more harm than good in more ways than one. It's backsliding, in a way. Azumi frowns, a bitter taste in his mouth, a bad taste in his mouth, ash and smoke. Forgive me for being straightforward, but I have to ask. Do you or do you not want to do better? The answer is too far to make out. He screws his eyes shut. With a surprising amount of genuineness, he replies, I don't know. In his mind's eye, he thinks he can see a maelstrom of feathers, a ballroom filled with them. There's an art to conversation, and for the longest time, Azumi had convinced himself that he was excellent at it. Perhaps he still is, if he could pull himself together. There are cues and hints, tones and indicators. The way people talk and the way they word things make it all the easier for him to guide a conversation how he wants it to go. He has had enough practice to learning to dance, and yet, Hatsumi Akisato has learned to dance, but somehow has turned it into a different movement. The steps are familiar but still alien, and he finds himself stumbling over his feet. He's not the one in control. Had he ever been? He can hear the rustling of fabric for a bit. When she speaks, Akisato sounds much softer. It must have been quite hard on you, hasn't it? Azumi does not answer, but when he opens his eyes again, he sees that Akisato has stepped closer to him. Bettering yourself takes quite a bit of energy, doesn't it? She continues. Sometimes it feels easier to stop or to give up. But let's not worry about that right now, alright? We can take a moment to rest. You can take as much time as you need. He stares at her in disbelief for a long moment, watching as she wipes her hands of the soil she'd been toiling with for the better part of the day and takes a seat on the bench nearby. How long has it been since he's heard someone say that? Hasn't he heard someone say that earlier? Not too long ago? You must be tired. Please rest. When was the last time you actually followed that advice? Feels like too long. Sometimes he wonders what it must feel like to be comfortable enough to let his guard down. The words are out before he realizes what he's saying. I'm sorry. When Akisato blinks up at him in surprise, Azumi falters and continues, For, insulting you just now. No, that's not quite right. That doesn't help untie the knot he feels in his chest. Oh! Akisato giggles. That's quite alright. I know you can be rather standoffish. With a rather straightforward response. Somehow Azumi finds himself able to let out a huff that might be a laugh, and he sits down on the other end of the bench. It's not the whole story, though, and he hesitates for another moment as he struggles to find the right words. It had been so easy back then to pull the trigger and laugh. But now... His smirk slips. That's not just it, though. I'll stop you right there, Azumi-san, Akisato replies. But she cuts him off with a shake of her head. If it's an apology for what happened to my father, believe me, I think I already know. Despite himself, despite the feeling in his chest, Azumi bites his tongue. There is no denying that my father was a reprehensible man, Akisato continues. He viewed others around him as tools to elevate himself into higher standing. In his palace, even his employees appeared as mechanized workers that were disposed of the moment they stopped functioning properly. There is no doubt that he needed to be stopped. That is why I agreed to join the Spirit Rogues, after all. But I would be lying if I said I was not hoping that his change of heart could be a new beginning for him. You see, I do remember the days when my father was a much kinder man, and I was looking forward to the chance to help him relearn what he meant to me. If there truly was some shred of the old Kazuyuki Akisato still in him, and I wanted to be able to help him reconnect with it. She pauses, taking a deep breath. I appreciate your apology. In fact, I'm very glad to hear it. To me, it's enough evidence that you've been making great progress. But truth be told, I've spent a long time thinking about this conversation as a possibility, ever since the rest of us had heard about your revival. And I don't think I can accept it in good conscience. When it comes down to it, you still took the life of someone very important to me. You still hurt me in a way that I can't ever come back from. An apology alone won't ever change that, and it won't make up for the days that could have been. And Azumi stares for a long, long moment, taking in the words and the point she is trying to make. It's not the response he'd been expecting, but at the same time, the tight knot in his chest loosens, if only somewhat. He takes a deep breath. Another. That is... A short laugh escapes in the middle of his sentence. That is perhaps the most reasonable thing I've heard someone say this entire time. Are you sure you're not the most sane member of the Spirit Rogues? Akisato's eyebrows raise. Well, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say that. Another chuckle. It feels hoarse, almost like it hasn't been used in so long. Azumi shakes his head. But no, you have a point, and you made your case in a way that I suppose makes sense to me. You're right. You are within your right not to accept my apology, and truth be told, I hadn't been expecting you to. But I hadn't expected you to be so appreciative, so to speak, of it regardless. Yes, well... oh, excuse me. Sorry, I needed some water. Ooh. Yes, well... Akisato clears her throat, resettling in her position where she's been sitting on the bench and lifting a hand to fidget with her curls. I suppose having so long to think about it ever since it happened helped a little to arrive at this resolution, if you want to call it that. If I'm being honest, I think I might have stopped being angry after a year. I think, at least now, I would rather wish you well and move on rather than to continue to wish for your demise. Maybe in the future my stance will change and I will forgive you, but I think that this is where I am most comfortable for the time being. Huh. Surprisingly, Azumi can understand that too. He is, after all, missing 2 years, but the sentiment is so purely Akisato that he can't help but take the moment to mull over it fully and conclude to take it at face value. What an incredibly what an incredibly mature, yet kind individual. Even back then, when he'd been planning to take down the Spirit Rogues, there had been that air about her. Now part of him wonders if he's deserving of that treatment. Part of him grasps onto the fact that she's proven herself to just be like this, and he is willing to accept that. Perhaps the both of them truly did grow up too quickly. Too young for what they do, too mature to fit in their skin. Despite their different lifestyles growing up, there is no denying the similarities. The celebrity and the heiress to a fortune, the privilege that came with it, the superficial love thrown in their wake. He can't help but wonder how their relationship with each other would stand had things been different. If I may ask, Akisato breaks the short silence between them. How are you feeling right now? Azumi takes a moment, long enough to contemplate, but short enough to not let this instance drag on. The knot in his chest is looser, yes, but there still, throbbing like a current underneath his beating heart. Better, I think, he answers at last. Not perfect, but yes, likely better than I had been. I think asking you to be back to your full 100% would be asking too much, Akisato admits. But better is still good. Recovery takes time, after all. It takes time for a flower to blossom. And in that time, she continues, leaning as she places her hands in her lap and looks towards Azumi fully. If you ever need anything, don't be afraid to ask. I'll do my best to help. He hums thoughtfully at that. How kind of her. Another character trait to expect from Hatsumi Akisato. I appreciate it. And it's fine. He's fine. At least he thinks he is, which is greater than how he started. No threat, not any obvious ones at that. Able to relax. He feels like he can breathe for the first time in a while, and he lets himself sigh. There is a lot he could talk to Akisato about. They do, after all, have so much in common, having both known what it is like to live in such a privileged way, to know superficial smiles for most of their life, to want more beyond that. Perhaps one day, if he can find it within himself, he may be able to call himself privileged to know Akisato-san. For now, though, Azumi can only manage 2 words. Thank you. And thank you so much for our listening audience, both now and in the future. Thank you for listening. Gosh. For now, I bid you all a good time zone. Bye.